mention your alma mater. You graduated from Melbourne University?
Yeah.
Okay. School of Law or Anthropology?
Well, I have a BA in history and anthropology, and but my PhD was with Tim, which is and Abdullah Saeed. So he was the other supervisor.
It's kind of, we can start right. Okay, everyone. Good afternoon. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much for attending this seminar. This is one of our series, and now we are very honored to have Dr. Jeremy Kingsley with us. He is, okay, we can say as legal anthropologist. He was trained in not only in anthropology but also in legal studies. He graduated from University of Melbourne, and he has conducted many important works in Indonesia. So since the late of 2000 and around 2000, he conducted fieldwork in Lombok, studying the role of a religious authority in religious governance, not only in politics, but also in everyday life or in Lombok. And now he moves to another type of study, which is the interconnection between religion and law. And with his colleague, he's conducted in legal ASEAN and studies, and now he is going to present one of his work, which is about the encounters between what we call as something like continental law and Islamic law. How these two types of law meet together and change the way people in Indonesia deal with economic business, right?
Yeah.
So in political science, the development of law is very important in the sense that it led to the development of the commerce and economic growth and etc. But somehow, when the written law was developed, before it was developed, societies have different kinds of laws. It can be written and orally transmitted around people. And the development of law in Islam somehow in some societies can be characterized by such situation. But now when Muslim societies face with many other societies, and now they have to do commerce and using different types of law, so there can be new situations, new challenges that have been to be faced. Now we are very happy to have Dr. Jeremy Kingsley to talk about his research about this important subject. Okay, without further ado, I'll ask Dr. Jeremy Kingsley to start his presentation. Thank you.
Terima kasih. Selamat sore semuanya. I'm sorry, I'm going to apologize. So I'm going to do it in English because it's going to cut across some very complicated legal theory and political theory alongside sort of anthropological findings that underpin a lot of my work. To assist you understanding where this is all coming from, let me give you just a very quick snapshot of the research project, which is called that I'm doing at the moment, which is called Interasian Legalities. And that started after I finished my work on Lombok and religious authority. And I wasn't concerned when I was looking at Lombok about religious authority the way a lot of people look at it. I didn't care so much about politics. Yes, the Tuan Guru or Kiai that I lived with was very involved in Golkar. Yes, they had dalliances with other political parties and groups, and there was obviously politics in a day-to-day sense that was going on. What I had been concerned with, where it flows on to what I'm doing now, is the way that these religious leaders were influential in rulemaking. So the way that they actually created the social ordering in society. And in Lombok, probably very similar to Jawa Timur or Aceh, the way that religion plays a role in day-to-day life is incredibly intrinsic. So it isn't just, and it isn't just about sort of political Islam, but an Islam which is bedded into people's everyday lives, and it emanated out of Pesantren. And what interests me was Pesantren as business entities, okay, as places of capital and not just places of spirituality. And that's where it fits into this research. What I'm interested in now is the way that laws jump borders. State governments, such as the Republic of Indonesia or the Commonwealth of Australia, are all concerned, when we talk about law, are all concerned in our jurisdiction. But we all know that business doesn't work like that anymore, no matter how much we like it to work like that. It's much more pragmatic and it moves across borders. And what I want to talk about today is the fact that although it sounds like it's about globalization, the narrative has an incredibly longer history, one in which Islam is central to that narrative, especially in this part of the world. Okay. Over the last 300 years, Islam has gone through a very pronounced period of social and political thinking and change. You know, and you see that emanating out of Egypt and emanating in the modernist movement, which obviously has a significant role in Indonesia through organisations such as Muhammadiyah. But it wasn't an idea on its own. Modernism didn't just come to, out of sort of mosques in sort of Cairo as a sort of strange, idea that was apolitical. It was of the moment of what was coming out of emancipation, out of enlightenment, out of the modernist idea. And in the modernist idea for law, this is where it becomes important for law. Modernism said a few very clear things. It said law needs to be positivist, it needs to be written, it needs to be clear, and you should be able to read and understand it consistently from reading the statute. If I read thing, I should know exactly what that statute is talking about, and that's that. Okay? It's a positivist way of looking at law. And I'm not critiquing positivism. There's lots that can be said about positivism, but I want to look back into the traditions of both common law, and this is going to be a strange parallel, and jurisprudential Islam. When I talk about jurisprudential Islam, I'm talking about a Sufi-influenced Islam, much more akin to Nahdlatul Ulama. It's the underpinning ideas. What's the underpinning ideas? The underpinning idea is that I don't learn purely by my own power and my own intellect. I learn and build upon that learning as a lawyer or as a jurist, right, based on earlier learning. I imbibe a lineage of ideas and knowledge. What is common law? Common law is case law, in which is built up over years. So if you go to a law library in Australia, which is a common law jurisdiction, or America, or the United Kingdom, what you see is volumes and volumes and volumes of cases, which looks exactly like volumes and volumes of fiqh. Absolutely no different. What is it? And even, I know people are sort of going to say this is strange, but what it is the idea that you deal with particular problems through particular momentary analysis. We see in Indonesia, you see that through fatwa. What is a fatwa? Fatwa is a response to a particular legal problem. Should I be able to do this? Is this halal? Is this not halal? Should I be able to go there? When does, the perennial one, when does Ramadan start? Okay. it's become, and it is a specific legal answer to a specific legal question. This is different, in fact. So I am paralleling the jurisdiction I come from to part of the legal tradition of Indonesia. So other part of the legal tradition in Indonesia is civil. And civil law has never taken case law or that sort of building up a accrual of knowledge as seriously. But it would be naive to think that lineaged learning isn't important in civil law. It just happens in different ways. It happens through academic writing and scholars rather than court cases. So if you're wanting to know in Europe, in France or in Germany or in the Netherlands, which is where sort of the inheritance of Indonesia comes from, you look to like scholarly writings. One of the problems, though, that has emerged with modernism, and it's one of the downsides to modernism, is a belief in certainty, consistency. What I found is one of the reasons. Well, sorry, let me go back a step. Commercial life requires flexibility. It's essential. It's not just a lack of regulation, it's a regulation which can move according to the economic needs, the business environment needs. Now, that will partly explain why Islam became so important in Southeast Asia. It wasn't just that the region suddenly saw a doctrinal necessity. Islam is also incredibly pragmatic. Jurisprudential Islam is actually incredibly pragmatic. It allowed, so when you bring over religious leaders, right? So when the trade winds, and we're talking, the work of Michael Latham here, when the trade winds bring over Islam, they bring over scholars. But you've got to have things for scholars to do. I mean, the world, we were talking about this before, but one of the ways that the world works is through money. If you want a religious elite to arise, they have to be funded. You may fund it by the state, you may fund it through. But what happens in Southeast Asia is that Islam becomes the basis, as and we're talking well into the colonial period. Islam becomes the mode of documenting commercial interactions and resolving them. Documenting and resolving. And the importance is that they are truly transnational. So it did not matter if you were dealing with a scholar in Mumbai or Bombay or whatever it was called in the port city in the Bay of Bengal, or you were dealing with a sultanate in central Java, or you were dealing in the merchant towns of Malacca, or even in the Indian Ocean sort of world, in the the eastern parts of Africa. These were trade networks. The Gulf states in Aden, now we're followed by the sort of states of Dubai, etc., have also followed these ideas. It is not a surprise. Why is it not a surprise? Because this form of jurisprudential Islam was incredibly flexible and pragmatic. Now, let me be very clear. When I talk about flexibility, a lot of legal scholars will freak out. Because when I say what lawyers want is to know that if they have a document and prepare a document for a client, that will hold up. If it gets disputed, that it won't be deemed illegitimate or void or not valid for an array of different reasons. But what I mean is that Islam was incredibly functional. So it's often, one of the reasons that modernism arose was actually because, in a political sense, there was the belief that Islam was becoming backwards. But the funny thing was that backwards Islam that modernity was responding to was also incredibly good at documenting commercial relationships and resolving disputes underpinning those commercial relationships. And I have to be very clear here that those commercial relationships guided by Islamic documents were not only covering people of the Islamic faith. People, non-Muslims would also follow these documents and would recognize, and this has been one of the sort of really interesting things that historically emerged was, you weren't suddenly going to be a second-class citizen in a commercial dispute if you didn't happen to be Muslim. That was a very interesting point in these documentations, that these Islamic scholars were incredibly pragmatic. If you were being chauvinist and all you cared about was the Muslims who were doing the transactions, do you think anyone would want to trade using a sort of Islamic document? And the answer is no. So, what happens with the trade winds, what makes Southeast Asian Islam is not just a finding of faith, and I don't want to undermine that as well. So, but what it was incredibly practical to mercantile life. Now, why is that important today? Well, it's important today because more often than not, we misunderstand the role. Lots of people have misunderstood the role of ideas such as consistency and certainty with ideas of functionality. And one of the things that is actually facilitating a lex mercatoria or a reimagining of mercantile life across Asia are these functional approaches to legal thinking. And that is embodied in documents, contracts, and informal dispute resolution that is not underpinned by the state. And that's international commercial arbitration. And in that instance, you see places like SIAC in Singapore, DIFIC, which I've written about in Dubai, or in Hong Kong exchange. And the bigger ones, the traditional ones in Paris and in London and New York. So what I'm really wanting us to think about is to reconceptualize this law prefaced on three presumptions. And these are the three presumptions, and then I'll start to take questions. The first presumption is that no matter how much the state likes it or dislikes it, private law guided by non-state mechanisms is becoming increasingly dominant. Caveat to that point, that does not mean the state is irrelevant. Now, let me give you the two examples that are most obvious. You cannot have Indonesia, just like about 100 odd plus countries, are signatories to the New York Convention on the enforcement of arbitral provisions, i.e., you need the state in the end to enforce. If we're having a dispute and we've come to an arbitration finds in my favour, but I want to enforce it. Unless the state, and you say I'm not going to enforce it, the only way that I can get that enforced is through a domestic court. In Jakarta, we're talking really about two courts, two very particular courts, Pengadilan Negeri Jakarta Pusat and Pengadilan Negeri Jakarta Selatan, those two courts. Just as you have the central London courts of commerce, i.e. these are courts which have become very au fait and able to manage complicated legal matters. That's the first point. The second point is that I want us to start recognising that although we are coming from an array of different legal traditions, that actually a lot of our legal traditions intersect in what made them successful. Common law was successful, and then equity within the common law jurisdictions, so that I can explain a bit more about what equity is later, courts of equity. But they were successful just as jurisprudential Islam was, because they were flexible. You could rely on them, but they were flexible, pragmatic. Okay? And thirdly, that we should replace this idea of consistency with the notion in relation to law of the importance being on functionality, i.e. fit for purpose. And if you were looking at functionality rather than consistency, that changes the way we start to look at the benefits and the role of institutions in Indonesia, for instance, such as Nahdlatul Ulama and their networks. Not just as political entities, but as importantly, and or social entities, but really fundamentally as business entities. So I was in the second poorest province in Indonesia. Really, oh well, I mean, it depends if you split Papua into multiple or singular. It's then, you know, third poorest or second poorest. But outside Papua, Lombok or Nusa Tenggara Barat is on all indexes economically the least advanced. Okay? But what floated the economy? What makes things work? Islamic boarding schools. These Islamic boarding schools run simpan pinjams or credit unions. They run savings systems. They run business networks. They promote documents which are accepted amongst everyone, and which, if are signed by the right people, have more validity, and honestly, than documents signed by the governor. There was a joke in Lombok, and it's not such a joke, to be honest. Was Tuan Guru Bajang, the governor just before the most recent one, who was the head of Nahdlatul Watan. Very similar, if you don't know it, to Nahdlatul Ulama. It's local, it's in Lombok. It's about 3 million members. Was it a backward step for him to become governor? Was he more powerful just as the head of Nahdlatul Watan, Panchol? Or would it, and I know that's for a Westerner, even discussing that as a potential joke is not funny. It's not really, I would never say the provincial head, the head of my state, Dan Andrews, who's the premier of my state, he's much more powerful than non-state religious leaders. But like I said, it's about the configuration that works in the place. It's not a value judgment, but in Lombok, these are social units which have commercial validity because you can rely on the documents they're based on. That's why they work. And they work because not only is economics important as per se to make money, but economics works because it works socially. Lombok had for generations been plagued by famine, mass famine. One way that they really started to manage, it was also the state which helped as well, but they really started to manage famine and sort of the cyclical weather problems that they would have, would be through religious organisations that ran businesses which were able to manage those sort of challenges. So what I'm wanting us to say is to look at law in a very practical way when engaging with commerce. And when we're looking at law as a very practical thing, in Indonesia, I would suggest that it's better to look at its own Islamic legal lineage even than a lot of Western systems, even though that's a controversial statement. And the reason I say that is because they work. And they are what transnational law looks like now. And the last point I'll make is, if you don't believe me, just take a hard look at any law firm in Indonesia. And let me look at the largest law firm in Indonesia, Asagaf Hamzah. Asagaf Hamzah is led by Fikri Asagaf, Chandra. Look at their lineage. In past lives, I can imagine Fikri having been an Islamic scholar. He's a pious, but he also has a mind which works like a traditional Sayyid would have worked. He works like that. He also happens now to work in one of Indonesia's most important law firms, not by surprise. And on that note, I'd love to hear questions. And I'm sorry for rambling on and sort of going in a multitude of different directions, but it's actually a topic which I think we don't often look at, how we look at sort of transnational Islam, but as a real force for commerce, and not just, often we talk about it in the political realm. On that note, I'm happy to answer any questions or...
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Kingsley, for your very insightful presentation of how defining or how studying the connection or encounters between the Islamic law and the modern or positivist law, and how to do it from the practical day-to-day commercial activities. And one thing that you say, that rather than the certainty and consistency, actually what we have at the most is the functionality of the law as practiced by the Muslim. Now we have usually we schedule the Brownbag until 2:30.
Yep.
So we know we have around an hour. So if you have some questions, some comment, please raise your hand. We have lots of time to discuss with Dr. Jeremy. So one thing, if I might start from your presentation, Dr. Jeremy, it reminds me of the first is the debate in in the study of the development of the capitalism. Some scholars suggest that one of the problems with the Muslim society is that the differences between the law that they practice and the development of the imperative of the modern capitalism, right? And according to them, that's one of the reasons why the top or not the top, but at that time, it's mercantilist capitalism that was developed in Muslim society, and they didn't go until the industrial one. Well, the West actually they went to industrial capitalism, and one of the things is that, well, the functionality of the law, it allowed Muslim merchants to do the commerce across the region, but they didn't have a new system like the banking system, right? And now in Indonesia, I wrote your new paper by with you and I think with another
yeah.
And you talk about the problems that people might raise because of the differences between the Western law and the Muslim law. Certainly from, say, intercultural understanding perspective, it is good that we know each other, that there are different legal traditions and people should know each other. But certainly life is not only about intercultural understanding. There is a kind of power relations, certainly competitions. And for the competition, somehow the more powerful or the more competitive might define how the commerce should be organized, right? So what do you think about the encounters between Islamic law and modern law contribute to the problem that we face today in
well, Islam? I mean, the two major divisions in Indonesian thinking on Islam, traditionalists in Nahdlatul Ulama, modernists in Muhammadiyah, okay? The major. There are lots of others in the spectrum, but the two sort of big players. Our response to this exact question: In Cairo, when modernism was being founded as an idea, it was being done because people were seeing the strength of colonialism in ripping apart Egyptian society. That's what, and people went and said, well, look, if this is happening for us now, there must be something wrong with us. Hey, or at least we're missing something. If we're not, it's not wrong, we're at least missing something. Why are we in this predicament? Okay, that's the answer. So this discussion that we're having in Islam is prefaced on this idea of capitalism, colonialism, etc. But only thinking about that cleavage means that Indonesians will consistently miss the sort of strength of ports such as Batavia, ports such as Malacca, in this period of transition pre and even into the colonial period. Why was Malacca grabbed by the Portuguese and pillaged and raped? It was because it was such an incredibly lucrative hub. I mean, they stuffed it up because they wanted to, put in good, sort of stamp down on what was going on. But the reason it had been such a mecca of business was because Islam had provided a sense of legitimacy and authority to an application of commercial relationships. That's actually the important part of the discussion. In my work, I've always looked at this idea of authority and legitimacy. Right? And that's what makes law have substance. Now, like I said, there are really important things about modernism. Modernism was an attempt to say that I can have a personal connection through my reading of a text in a direct hermeneutic sense. That's actually really powerful. I don't want to dismiss that. I'm not trying to neuter it. I'm just trying to sort of place where that thinking came from. Jurisprudential, and you could say, but these Islamic scholars, who are doing jurisprudential Islamic thinking, these fiqh scholars, they were just, they were boring and sort of arcane and sort of stuck in thick mud of tradition. That same critique can be placed to common law judges. They are stuck in arcane thickets of historical court cases and can't see beyond it. So that's a common trope, both ways. What I'm wanting us to think through is this idea of what does it take and why is it that capital accrued in places like London and not places like Malacca in the same institutionalized ways? But I don't think you can purely look at things when you look at that analysis of capitalism as a purely mercantile adventure. They were military, right? The reason that the Malacca basically dies as a mercantile centre. Malacca is an Islamic centre in Southeast Asia. It's just like in Malaysia, but it's it's of the region, is because of gunboats, military power, which is no different to how China or America operate generally. I mean, we were speaking before about the role of superpowers. So superpowers, the role of capitalism isn't politically neutral, right? It's power politics. And power politics is part of what is also part of this narrative. But it's not the only point. And I think that's actually really important. And I think one of the things that you see emerging now and starting to really change the dynamics of capitalism is hubs such as Dubai emerging as incredibly important financial centres. And financial centres that are fully global. I mean, so for this research that I did, I remember going into a cafe and sitting in a cafe, and behind me were people speaking Farsi. In front of me were people speaking Arabic. To the side were people speaking Mandarin, and on the other side, and this is before the Abrahamic Accords, there was people speaking Hebrew, and they're all doing business in Dubai. Okay, and that was so it was absolutely a-religious, but then absolutely religious at the same time. Okay. So when I say it's a-religious, I don't mean that religion disappears. I mean, actually, religion is fundamental, but it allows it to function because it says it's an open space. Why, as Islam comes across in the trade winds, according to Laffin, does it work? It works because it's practical. It's pragmatic. How does the Lloyds of London board start? Does anyone know the story about how Lloyds of London starts? What is it? Who knows what does Lloyds of London start as? Starts as a cafe near the port. And traders started to meet and do business, and they used to write up, they just had a board up on the wall, just like here. So I'm going to walk off. But just like here, they have a board with, like a chalk and write figures. This ship's coming in, this ship's coming out. This is what's on that one. If you want to invest in this, you want to put insurance on that. That's how it was happened. That's what it was. That's Lloyds of London, a cafe which becomes a multi-trillion, billion-dollar business out of a thing, purely practical. Everyone loves their morning coffee, especially me. It develops into a commercial hub. DFIC, the Dubai International Financial Centre, is in many ways artificial, right? The government has set about to set up a domain to do business. But here's the ticket to that. It is artificial, but it is also broadly accepted. It is artificial, but a lot of energy and creative business is occurring there now. When you look, there are almost as many law firms now in Dubai as in the City of London. All of the major Magic Circle, Silver Circle, White Shoe law firms from America, Magic Circle and Silver Circle are the big law firms out of London. White Shoe are the big law firms out of New York. They all have offices in Dubai, not by chance. And they're not like, 2 or 3 people offices.
Because there are many problems.
No, because there's lots of money. No, lawyers are always problems are the same thing as opportunities.
Problems mean money.
Problems mean money, opportunity. Lawyers don't exist without problems. That's what we are. Lawyers are either try and avoid problems or try and solve problems. We try and write a contract which avoids a problem, or we try and resolve the problem which prevents it. So capital, that's the thing I think. What I actually think, and Fahad Bashara has started to really write on this in his book on the Sea of Debt, and his now work on capitalism, is really trying to say something which I think is really important to an institution like this, which is that it's not about Islamic finance. It's about Muslims who do business and do business well. And religious leaders who are able to understand yes, maybe they understand Islamic law, but what they really understand is how to facilitate business people making good decisions and business people resolving their disputes about decisions which go awry, which just happens all the time. I mean, that's just the nature of it.
I think in Islamic term, there's a word called muamalah, like business, muamalah, meaning like looking
it's like joint ventures.
Yeah, the partners of business and adjusting the needs, profits based on the partner of business. But I have a simple question. Like you criticize consistently issue in dealing with business, and you offer trans-regional type, like a functionality of economy means more taking more role in in the legal issues of the state, for instance. I kind of see that you try to challenge this kind of established type of legal business of the state, and going towards more on advocating the autonomous non-state communal mercantilism. Let's say in Indonesia, maybe you observe there are this kind of religious people, Muslims, dealing with their own Muslim partner, which is seeing no race barriers in that, and that's why you stand your ideas. Just kind of wondering, like maybe the issue of consistency is more applicable to those people having the kind of natural differences, like the geography, the mindset of the community. Here in Indonesia, we have like multiracial.
Yeah.
Obviously, they are multiracial.
Yeah.
That's why functionality works better than in Europe, which is based more on the genealogical connection, something like that.
So I should be very clear. I'm not saying consistency doesn't matter. As a lawyer, people would hang me for saying such terrible, disgraceful things. Consistency matters. Of course it matters. It matters that you can trust, have faith in a document that you sign. So the article that you were speaking about, that Nadia Patim and I wrote together, was really challenging Indonesia's contract law and sort of saying there's a problem with the application of Indonesian contract law because you can't necessarily feel confident in the contracts that you sign being upheld in court. And there's a whole lot of issues that is a issue that says, obviously, consistency is important. A business person doesn't want to have risk that is so high because they can't tell if they're going to be able to trust the deal. But here's the thing that I'm saying. I'm saying it's not saying consistency isn't an issue. It's saying that it's part of the issue of functionality. But a consistency which is pragmatic is what's important. And it's not just about, I think that transnational legal affairs shows up these ideas of functionality most clearly. Now, in Indonesia, to be very frank about it, I write one of the things I'm writing about is a nationalized globalization. And you can see the nationalized globalization in Indonesia coming through in the legal services sector, in which no Indonesian law firm is part of a global law firm. According to Indonesian laws, you have to be a local partnership that can affiliate to an international partnership. So you see HHP, which is Baker McKenzie, AHP, which is Asghaf Hamza, which is connected to Raja and Tan, but they're not part of the network. They are not the network. Part of the reason that these two law firms are number one and number two and fighting tooth and nail to be the top law firm in Indonesia is because they're actually, interestingly, both law firms have incredibly fluid partnership structures. The structure of Raja and Tan, for instance, which is AHP, is one of a close working relationship rather than a Raja and Tan, we're all Raja and Tan. They are really great law firms across ASEAN that all work together and try and coordinate and self-promote and refer, okay? Baker and McKenzie, which is HHP, right? That is was an American-based firm which now has its domicile in a Swiss Verein, which is in one of the Swiss cantons, and through that canton is very fluid. So each of the partnership models is separated. It's sort of registered centrally, but it's very independent, which works perfectly for Indonesia because Indonesia, it sort of works structurally to the way it should work. But what I'm saying is there is no removal of the state from this discussion. But what there is an awareness that if a state doesn't understand the fluidity that's necessary, it's not, and let me be very clear, and I'll tell you as a lawyer, it's Indonesia that will suffer. And let me give you the example as to how Indonesia suffers. I am setting up a contract for one of, is this live? Okay, so I'm not going to give that example. What is known, and this is in the public domain, is that a lot of contracts, business contracts that are signed into Indonesia, so these are businesses which are being undertaken in Indonesia, a lot of the risk and therefore the profit is held elsewhere. You structure and same thing happens in Malaysia, by the way. You structure the risk and the profit in Singapore, where you know your contract will be upheld, and they'll allow these international transactions, and so you extract, going to what you're saying, the capital out of the place. Okay? Now, it sounds counterintuitive because why does Indonesia feel rightly the need to have a very strong central legal system? Part of it is because it had an incredibly extractive legal history. The Dutch were incredibly extractive. That was let's be clear, guys. Indonesia was the most lucrative colonial asset in history, par excellence, no questions asked. And therefore, that anger and emotional gut reaction to extractive capitalism, which is so strong in Indonesia, is understandable, but it's also not necessarily wise. Yeah, and so the question is, how do you protect Indonesian assets, wealth, social fabric, right, in an environment which continues to be increasingly transnational, right? How do you balance it? Sometimes, in a legal sense, the answer is counterintuitive. Actually, it's by looking at the way that structures are working and allowing Indonesian law to become able to capture that transnational. So that actually what happens is that people put the risk and profit in a Jakarta bank rather than the risk and profit in a Singaporean bank. And so this is what I'm saying, and it's not, but it is counterintuitive. And therefore, because it's counterintuitive, it's politically, as you know, the political science people, it is a challenge to show that that's actually valid. Because the actual fear, the actual hatred, and when I say hatred, I mean, look, let's be clear, it's fair enough to be angry. It is fair enough for the Indonesian body politic underneath everything to have an anger towards extractive capitalism, a real anger. The question is, how do you maintain your resources and your assets while also being part of keeping those resources and assets, right?
Yeah.
And that's the challenge.
Yeah, I try to connect, like when you say tradition, it means totally about locality, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's say if you take the example of Aceh, for instance, who currently, implementing many types of Sharia law, including the economic one. It's not really working, for the local governance, let's say. But when you say locality, that means you go back to the history, right? The period before colonialism, like the archives, this type of records that justify the tradition. That is the kind of economical tradition which is fluid and affordable, to all kind of differences. With that sort of thing, it will need, you will need hundreds of years of processes to compile back. I don't know, how fluid is the local tradition that you have found?
Well, so let me give you the simple answer to this reality. Everyone talks about globalization or globalization. Globalization was that movement say it's all, global and local, and there's globalization, which is capital flows over the top. But Apadarai, the scholar, the sort of, Indian origin American scholar, talks about the idea that globalization has to localize. It has to let it land, right? And that's true. Let me give you a pragmatic, that's a theoretical position. I'm going to give you the practical reason for it. In the early 1970s, Allen and Overy, which is now, it has a law firm, associated law firm in Jakarta, it was a high value, small law firm. It was Magic Circle, but it had about 10 partners in one location, central London. Now, Allen and Overy would have, I think, about 700 partners in 40 to 60 locations. I have to check that again, but i.e., it has offices from South Africa through to the Gulf states, through to South Asia or affiliations in South Asia, through to Southeast Asia, onto East Asia and Australia. Well, Australia as well, but not that important. I shouldn't say that, but so actually, what we're talking about is the globalization is anomalous. One of the things that everyone thought was that in globalization, it would become that the local would become unimportant. The Indonesia wouldn't count. What I'm actually saying is that for globalization to actually be effective, Indonesia counts, China counts, the Gulf states count. They all count in different ways, right? And for different reasons and on different trading routes. But the trade winds are still what guide all of these discussions. And so I just wanted to sort of say that before I let us open it up more broadly.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. So your last point, especially with regard to the profit and risk, is very interesting that a country or government or society should be able to concentrate or to make the signing of the contract with its profit and risk in their country rather than outside of the country, right? So, but the point is that politically, how is it possible that a country should think about, well, if I would like to protect the legal entities in my country, actually the context should be in my country. Now, let me invite, we have students here who are from other countries, not only from Indonesia. So I believe that such a challenge should apply not only to countries like Indonesia, but also other countries. But they might have different perspective opinions. So now let me open the forum for students to express any questions or comments or whatever they have in mind. You can raise your hand. Okay, so while waiting for their comment, I have Pak Philip. Okay, Pak Philip.
Thank you, Jeremy. I'm a student too. Because I have no legal studies training. I have Islamic law training. So I learned a lot from your very exciting speech. I have two quick questions. One, you're talking about the flexibility or the pragmatic nature of the Islamic law in terms of commerce. Now, my question will be, is it because you come across with this probably legal documents, practices, does it relate to the fact that Islam is inherently flexible and pragmatic? It depends on the interpretation, I think, of law. So then it relates to particular leaders, regime, government, at the point in time, right? So in the past, probably these jurisprudence were very flexible and pragmatic because the regime at that time probably are the ones who were, open-minded, less conservatives, and so on and so forth. So you see, it's leads to my second question. Regardless of the flexibility or the pragmatic nature, somehow we are talking about enforcement as well, right? So you have rules and regulations, but then in the past and even today, you need some sort of assurance that it will be protected by power, right? By governmental power. Now, again, the politics comes in. We cannot have purely flexible regulations, jurisprudence, without having a flexible and open-minded government. Seems to me, this is my personal belief, that Islam actually then, if you are right, that in terms of commerce, Islamic laws are very flexible. So actually, that Islam is promoting laissez-faire kind of economy, market. But what happened in the understanding of most people is that is not the case. Islam against market-oriented, blah blah blah, and so on. Because
the Prophet was never against the market.
Exactly, right.
The Prophet was never. I mean, and so I shouldn't. Sorry, I mean.
Wait.
Yeah.
I think Rifki also has similar question. Yes.
I would like to continue the questions from Pak about this flexibility. And another side, internationally, we have the trend of Shariaization.
Yeah.
Which is, I would like to say that it is Shariaization is kind of decisions, make things into more rigid. So how to reconcile about what you mentioned about the flexibilities versus Shariatizations in other side, while we are also facing the new world, which has become more integrated and digitalization, digitized world, and the business is also moving from traditional business into more spaceless business, such as the growing of different kind of, startups working on intermediary business in the banking transactions, like we have, for example, in here and other countries like Sanctifying, for example, and several other transactions. So I think that would be my additional questions to. I have several other questions.
That's good. We live in a complicated world, so I don't want to make this sound as if it's, no, I don't want to make it sound simple, right? It is incredibly complicated. I'm going to start backwards onto the digital and then go back. What is the only area that can involve in Indonesia 100% foreign ownership? Now, on the positive or negative investment list, whichever way the government wants to call it on the day.
Education now can be 100% foreign.
Yeah, but what's more important than education? Although, Australian universities like to parade it around. What's most important to the Indonesian economy and can be 100% foreign owned? Unicorns. All techs have 100% have allowance for up to 100% foreign ownership. It would be an interesting question to always ask ourselves, is the unicorns that we so privilege in Indonesia, how Indonesian are they? It's a question, a hypothetical question. What we're thinking about. I don't know. But that's where it becomes complicated. We are going through rapid digital transformation, but economies are not necessarily keeping up speed. I was in a job search last week, so we're hiring someone, and she was talking about platform economies in relation to employment. And was someone in the simple terms, in an illegal question, this is a simple legal question. Is a Gojek driver an employee or a contractor with the platform? They look and sound like employees because they all wear green jackets. They all have to follow the instruction of their online employer. but also they look like gig economy because they can come on and off when they like. They can take the jacket on. They can put a different jacket on. We're in traditionally very complicated times. So I don't want to dismiss that. Digital economy also makes a lot of what I'm talking about more consequential, because I would suggest to you that we're now in a time of fluid jurisdiction like never before, because it is incredibly hard for the Indonesian government, or any government for that matter, or any government, to capture what is going on in the economy in real time. Cryptocurrencies, for instance, are an exact sovereign risk problem for every single economy in this jurisdiction, in fact, globally. Because cryptocurrencies are not based in Australia or Indonesia or the United Arab Emirates or in India, wherever people are coming from. They're essentially on a platform which, if you do use blockchain, can be encrypted and kept secret from the government, unless the government has a key. And the government may or may not have the key, depending on how savvy they are. So last night when I came into Indonesia, not only did I have to get my SIM registered, they did some phone registration thing. Now, of course, that's an attempt to keep maintaining and controlling data. But that's, I guarantee you, 5 steps behind technology. And that's not a critique on the Indonesian government. That's just saying what it is. So all we're talking about now is creating the notion of fluid jurisdictions and making it more and more tricky for national governments to actually do it. And the rubber to the road comes into 2 key domains: ownership of businesses. That's what I got to about the negative investment list, which is a debate, much larger debate that we could have another time, or the positive investment list, just branding exercise, and these, this sort of digitalization. Now, I want to go on to Shariaization. So I remember when I was a corporate lawyer and I got given some banking contracts, because I was sort of in mergers and acquisitions in the corporate and finance, from an Islamic bank. Happened to be an Islamic bank in Indonesia. And I looked at the contract, and I looked at my template of finance documents. You calculate interest slightly differently, i.e. you're not meant to calculate riba, but what you do is you have a mathematical annual fee, which kind of looks something similar to what an interest rate fee would look like if you double back on the figures, right? You regenerate, now, I don't say that's halal or kosher or whatever we want to say it is, but it's clearly not, I don't think, the intention of riba or not riba, but that's what it did. You look at the contracts and they looked exactly like a standard form finance contract, except for Bismillah at the start. That was what it was. They added Bismillah and suddenly it became Sharia. Not really, but that's the sort of, that's the way. So when we talk about Shariaization, I think we're talking about a broad range of things. In a financial services sense, what you're finding is that Sharia is playing an interesting and important role in the financial services sector in a real and a challenging, but also a challenging way. And you also then have Shariaization in the way of thinking about the world, the political Islam way of Shariaization, which is a different burden. This sort of then flips back to your question about, we're talking about open and legitimate, sort of enlightened governments, and I don't think you need enlightened rulers to have enlightened rule. I'm going to look at Singapore. Singapore is a democracy of sorts. They vote, yes, but the PAP is not likely to go out in any elections in the foreseeable future. And they have a fairly dominant political role. I think we can say that. Are they open-minded? Are they liberal? No, not really. They are, but they believe in certain principles such as, for instance, the rule of law, which allowed them to leverage certain tools. So I think there is both, and if you look at another good example is like places like the Gulf states. Other Gulf states, you know, are we saying that the most democratic, or they're all monarchies? I mean, we're a monarchy too, but that's an anachronism of Australia. I shouldn't speak too loudly. But you know, we have a queen. But I think you sort of get what I'm sort of saying, that a lot of what we're talking about is both interconnected with, you know, in Bulair land, we like to talk about the democratic sort of withdrawal in Indonesia, like illiberalism. True, not true? It's complicated. We all know that. It is complicated. Democratic reform didn't happen in the United Kingdom, sort of, you know, in a spirit of 30 or 40 years. The Magna Carta happens at what, 1142 or 1042, and it takes, you know, we're now with Boris Johnson just about being dismissed last night, you know, for having parties during COVID. I mean, democracy is a funny thing. It doesn't work in a linear process. And if you want to, you know, people sort of expect it, and I know, so me and Patim will agree to disagree on, for instance, you know, how quickly reform should have happened with Reformasi. For me, the fact that there are still viable democratic institutions in Indonesia is shockingly surprising. Why? Because actually the size and scope of those institutions is so large, the ease in which you can capture them for particular interests is equally large. So the fact that it hasn't been totally captured by these interests isn't, for me, quite intriguing. It means that there is more change than that one would on the surface like to think. I don't mean that there aren't tides in the way that politics works. But what I do say is that it actually, we need to be careful with where we see the politics at a particular juncture in time, and also where we see and understand what's going on with law at that time. It would be, for a lot of people, for instance, and I know this would be unpopular for lots of people, but you could say, well, maybe Suharto was a great period for commerce in Indonesia. It was for certain people, wasn't for others, right? And so I want to be very clear, I am not talking about unadulterated market capitalism being the answer to everything. What I am talking about, and I'm not necessarily supporting that, what I am saying is that when we engage with lawmaking about economics, we need to understand the complexity and the fluidity of the jurisdictions within which we're working. Okay? Not necessarily the end outcome of those debates and discussions.
Jeremy, flexibility means also, doesn't mean that I can choose any law that's suitable for me when we are dealing on certain business. I have a case like this. A Muslim woman married an Australian man. So when they married, when they divorced, the man want to settle their house and their business in terms of economic Sharia, because it's benefit for him, because he's a man. And the woman would like to settle the conflict in the Australian court because have the equal opportunity.
Yeah.
So where is the flexibility of that?
Well, one of the trickiest areas of law is family law. And one of the areas which is the most murky when it comes to these transnational discussions is this. Now, you see this play out in really brutal terms when kids are kidnapped between jurisdictions, you know, taken by a mother or a father, you know, to Beirut, or taken by a mother or father to Australia. Yeah. And that, you know, this is not an uncommon thing. I want us to be, this is not like a laissez-faire situation in which any law applies at any time and you forum shop post fact to the way you do it. For instance, one of the worst elements of fatwa is fatwa shopping. So if you don't get the one, your first one, you try and get to the next one, then you try to get to the next one, and you know, you wait until you find the one that gives you the answer you want, or you know the one that's going to give you the answer you want. I mean, no, but so I'm not supporting like just you know doing whatever works. But what I am saying is that today, as of today, if you were running a construction company in Indonesia, right, and you were building, let's say, resorts in Bali or hotels in Jakarta, and you will be signing contracts with Accor, the Marriott Group, Santika Hotel, Alila, which is nominally Indonesian but actually based in Singapore. But they'll have these contracts in which you will say in those contracts, it's not Indonesian law which is going to apply. You will say overtly that it is Singaporean law that will apply. In fact, the article we were talking that Nadia and I wrote about was about the Indonesian language provisions in contract law and the fact that they were a mess which led to real trouble with knowing what would be applicable and what wouldn't be applicable. Because if in Indonesian, if you've ever seen large-scale Indonesian contracts, you'll see they're often in bilingual. The origin of the language of sort of original business negotiation, often English, but not only English. It can be French, Arabic, or Mandarin. Those are sort of big hubs of business. Or and the debate between which one applies, because in Indonesia, arguably, it's the Indonesian language one applies, even though the negotiation has happened, let's say in English. So you can choose as of today to ignore, not to ignore Indonesian law, but to resolve the dispute in French law or Saudi law, or whatever law you choose to do it in. So that can happen already today. You can choose those things. You can choose the forum for those disputes. The forum can be, one of the big tragedies in Indonesia at the moment is that there is a concern that Indonesian arbitral tribunals aren't fair and independent, which means what happens when that happens? It means people go to Singapore to resolve their disputes at SIAC or Hong Kong or Dubai. So that already happened. Those choices already happen. We often don't hear about them because those arbitral awards are private and secret. So you may not even know that there has been a major dispute between GoTo and Grab that has been arbitrated already in secret, private, in Singapore. You won't have known. Or, they're funny. So this is already happening. These fluid jurisdictions are there and they are real. And what I am trying to say in this forum is that flexibility isn't simply about accepting anything, right? But for us to start being real, and it's also Australia. Australia has the same naivety as Indonesia, but realizing that if you have fluid jurisdiction, you need to start regulating it in ways that that actually benefit the society, which
So Jeremy, back to your basic problem of the contradiction between flexibility and consistency or certainty. So what do you think of the thing that Indonesian people should do, whether to maintain the flexibility or actually to increase the consistency or certainty?
So I think so what I would say is you need consistency for legal arrangements. Okay, that is important. Right? It's not like it's one or the other. You need that as a base presumption because you can't do business. Business is done by allocating risk.
Yeah.
That's what business people do. They allocate risk. And you can't do that allocation of risk without a degree of consistency. What I am saying though is that when we understand and think through the risk, We need to be flexible and sort of functional about it. And this also goes to our discussion about what, you know, Bill said, you know, what should Australia's, you know, relation to Indonesia be? And my problem is that we ideationally don't see ourselves as your neighbour often, right? We see ourselves, I say ideationally, between London and New York, which means that we don't actually focus our ideas of fluid jurisdictions actually into this region, which is where the fluidity is. And let me be clear, this is an issue of complexity. Not the state doesn't matter, or not the private capital matters in totality. Actually, it's that the way that the state is going to have to engage with these issues of jurisdiction of private capital needs to be refined in a way that actually is open to it, but also makes it beneficial to the society that it works in.
So actually, that's, I think, the question. What is actually the connection between the fluidity, which I think is at the, say, in the lower level among the Muslim traders, while the fluidity at the top level, you say between Goto and Grab, for example, I don't see the connection in terms of the religion in that case. So is it because of religion, or actually is it the state? The state which failed to enforce the certainty across legal entities within the country, actually. It has no big relationship with religion, actually.
Well, so I've argued religion is a social force rather than a religious force. All right. No, obviously it's a religious force, so it's a spiritual force, obviously. But the way I look at at religion, and the way I looked at it in Lombok, was a social force. That's what was important to my analysis. I wasn't so concerned with the fiqh. I was concerned with the way that fiqh was used as a narrative, as a way of bringing people together, as a way of organising rules, as a way of allocating capital, etc., etc. Now, you say, what does that have to do with, your go-tos and your, billion-dollar company and the Kiai in Central Java? What it has to do with is these are two key players in the Indonesian economy, of which we're actually not realising how we're actually not regulating either. The Indonesian government is not regulating either. It doesn't regulate the top because it becomes supranational, right? Because the thing is, if you've got if you want to raise $10 billion, like say GoTo, it wants to rapidly expand, wants to go regional, it has to raise capital. If it wants to raise that capital, it becomes transnational. Okay, so it runs up. Be very careful, above the state. But it's not like, not above the state. In an English sense, it structures itself so it can raise that capital. If you look at Kiai, it's running in some ways below the state. Neither is separated from the state. But they're not, but these are realms which are also, look at the basic presumption. It was only 10 years ago. I studied in Pondok Pesantren Darul. Only 10 years ago did they include Pendidikan Umum, or the general national curriculum. Only 10 years ago. Now it's 15 years ago now. So now that shows you penetration of the state is tentative. But then again, absolutely. Tuan Guru Mustiari Apa, Tuan Guru Muhammad Arafat, these are people who are also actively involved in the political life of Lombok as well. So it's not that they're not, once again, it's not that they're it's not that the state is irrelevant, but that the state is working in regulatory structures which are much more complicated and fluid than we like to think it through. That's actually the point, that the legal regimes that we're employing need to take into account the fact that GoTo will seek $10 billion in foreign capital. And if it does that, how does it do that? And also understand that you've got Kiai Tuan Guru around the country who are very powerful and both work with the state, but also work outside of the state. That's the fluidity that I'm talking about in Indonesia.
Yeah, actually, there is another prospect. It's very interesting, very provocative, very interesting field of study. And I remember you also attached this kind of, like comparative religion as one of your methods.
Yeah.
In the narrative. And just so curious about we have students who are non-Muslims. Just curious how, if they can just share how the economy within their surroundings, adjustable to your narrative. I would be glad if someone can share ideas. Yes.
Secularism as well as industrial revolution. They are developed with the help of banking system. See, this banking system is completely opposite of Islam. It is based on riba. So even now, the commercial system and the business is incomplete without the banking system. And banking system cannot sustain without interest. How the Islamic jurisprudence deals with business, commercial sector. It deals with, because without interest and without banking sector, there will be no business, we cannot sustain.
Well, so I think it's a really important question. But my question for you is, what's riba? How do you define riba?
Riba is the interest.
That's an incredible simplification of the idea, isn't it? But it's actually much closer to usury rather than interest. In the West we clarified, and this is where but this is where usury is the idea that I will take to use Shylock in Merchant of Venice's idea, my pound of flesh for the transaction, that's usury. And if you do the translation and look at what riba actually translates closest to and how it actually engages in a fiqhi sense, it's much closer to that sort of notion but you're right. And I think this is the reality of the world. There are significantly more holdings in Indonesian banks that would have, let's not get into the definition of interest-bearing accounts than accounts holding Sharia compliant, in the general sense, accounts or forms of either using project finance or other forms of constructive arrangement to get finance. So you're totally right. And that transformation that you're talking about is part of the reason why the Gulf has invested, and when I say the Gulf, I mean the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Saudi Arabia have invested a lot of money, time and energy in trying to create a sort of financial pool, a capital pool that is, in their words, sort of Sharia compliant, right? We can all argue about, but that's what they're trying exactly to do, which is to create alternative sources of large-scale capital. But that's these are transformations, and even those pools of capital aren't necessarily enough to fund a lot of what is going on generally, because in Indonesia, I think, and it may have gone up, it's about 10% of the banking sector is Sharia.
Less than that.
Right, less than that. And Indonesia has an unbanked population of 70%. So you're saying less than 10% of 30% of the Indonesian population is Sharia compliant in relation to banking. We're talking 3 or 4% of the population are sitting in that field of being compliant with Sharia. So is it wrong? Is it right? I don't want to say. What I can say about Sharia compliant finance is that it has led to very interesting, and I think Muhammad is a good example of interesting financial services models, which I would draw akin to joint venture vehicles in the West, but it is its own vehicle. But they're flexible capital venture, raising vehicles. So it is. But the question is, how do you make financial instruments which are attractive across borders. That's actually where it becomes. How do you generate boards or places of funding that are Sharia compliant that can raise you the let's say, the next capital raising of go to, let's say they want to raise 5 billion, are they going to have would they be able at this time now to go to Sharia compliant funds and raise it? Maybe, and they probably pay a premium if they did. That's the challenge. So it's not, I'm not, like I said, if you're wanting to talk through these things, there are ways you can get Sharia compliant for something close to that, but it's all about capital.
Yeah.
It's, and that's, I don't mean that, I'm not strategy, but that's the clarity of that. That's the challenge of it.
One last thing before we stop,
Yeah.
I'm
happy for a talk as longer if people want.
There is one similarity between the tradition and what we see now. This is from the revenue, not revenue, what you call it, the profits margin applied by the Muslim communities, Muslim networks. Each month is much less than what the state gives. Let's say, I remember historically, there's one person made research and he found that the Muslim communities in 18th, 17th century applied about 2 to 5% of profits from all the commodities, unlike the Dutch at the time who applied 40%, 70%. Yeah. So even until now, we still see this kind of similar pattern applied within these Muslim communities. Let's say, I witnessed one time in Turkey, they have this kind of Jama'ah. They call this, tariqat-based mercantilism, very established. They just commerce between the Muslims and also the non-Muslims, and they apply to very less, profits. Let's say if the price of a commodity is like 10 lira, they just take
a small, small
50 kuros, they say. So yeah, in Indonesia also I witnessed similar thing. I think this is one of the things why these traditions, we're so fluid, attractable to,
But it's, I want us to sort of be very clear here, and this is important for all of your students, brothers. These traditions I'm talking about are all working along multiple faith lines. Common law emerges out of the, sort of English legal tradition, right? So it is a legal tradition which is Christian in its genus. Whether it's Christian and it's mercantilism is a different issue. When you're talking about Islam and you're talking about these mercantile traders, look at Aden and you look at the trading houses that were famous. And you know what you see when you see the trading houses that were famous? They were both, and you see them in Singapore, you see the Asagafs, the Al-Kafs, the Manassas. The last was a Jewish one, right? This is not an exclusive business arrangement that meant Muslims didn't care about anyone else or vice versa. If you look at the Gulf today, the strength of Dubai, for instance, has been the fact that it is willing, like it or loathe it, like what Dubai does or not, it has been willing to accept everyone doing business in its jurisdiction. That's how they've made their money. That's how they've made it. They've made it so that they will have and deal with everyone. And that's actually the interesting thing about that. That's what I mean by functionality.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeremy. So it seems that we still have many questions, but unfortunately now we are 20 to 3.
Sorry.
So, but that's fine. We learned a lot from you. as a new student of legal studies, one thing that I know is there is contradiction within consistency
Yeah, there must be.
and
If I said-
flexibility, and consistency does matter.
Oh God, I mean, if I said this in a law class, the consistency doesn't matter. I'd have students like in the back, like sweating and like, starting to cry, like, what is he talking about?
You ask a legal opinion to five
Yeah, they'll,
You get 20 of them.
exactly. And that's what I'm saying, fatwa, like, I love it. Like, people go, oh, there's consistency, but people like spend days looking for fatwa that work to their particular answer. So,
And another conclusion that I can take from this study is that this very interesting discussion results from the fact that Dr. Kingsley was trained in multiple disciplines, from anthropology to legal studies, and somehow he studied Islamic studies. So for our student here came from multiple backgrounds.
Yes.
So as long as you study and you increase your potential, certainly you will have very interesting topic of discussion. So let me end discussion. Thank you very much for having discussion today, and we hope that we can have you next time, and you don't want to come with us. Thank you very much, and Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Let's have a